Now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the use of force. Does Minneapolis have a written policy governing proper and authorized use of force?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And is this generally covered in the 5-300 series of the Policy and Procedure Manual?
Yes, it is.
I'd like to discuss some of that manual with you and the policy with you at this time. If we could pull and display Exhibit 216. Under the purpose of the policy, which is 5-301, can you please read the first sentence under subparagraph A?
Yes. Sanctity of life and the protection of the public shall be the cornerstones of the MPD's use of force policy.
What does that mean?
Of all the things that we do as peace officers for the Minneapolis Police Department, and I mentioned the thousands of calls that our men and women respond to, it is my firm belief that the one singular incident we will be judged forever on will be our use of force. And so while it is absolutely imperative that our officers go home at the end of their shift, we want to make sure and ensure that our community members go home too. And so sanctity of life is absolutely vital, that is the pillar for our use of force.
Has this generally always been the case with Minneapolis use of force policy?
It is not.
When did that change?
We implemented this particular in 2016.
Has the training and use of force and application of use of force policy been imparted, including this philosophy, onto police officers in training at the training center?
It certainly has, yes.
Does the policy itself define force? What is force?
Yes, it does.
If we could take a look at Exhibit 217, I'll publish that. If you'd highlight use of force. Okay, generally speaking, what is force?
It can be any physical contact. It can be with a weapon. It could be with a vehicle. But it's any sort of physical contact that is more likely to render harm or injury to someone.
Is the use of restraint considered force?
That would be considered force.
And what type of force is authorized under departmental policy?
We under 609, we operate under the use of force, the Graham v. Connor statute, objectively reasonable force.
And if I could display Exhibit 217. Let's see. First, go back to 5-303. 5-303 authorizes force, is that right? And you mentioned 60906, state statute authorizing force under certain circumstances, is that right?
Yes.
And the phrase that's used for the authorization of force is what type of force?
Reasonable.
And that force can be authorized under certain circumstances, is that right?
Yes.
All right. So now if you would go to the next page, and let's talk about the circumstances under which a police officer is authorized properly to use force. If you highlight that. What are the circumstances under which an officer is authorized to use force?
An officer is authorized to use force effecting a lawful arrest, executing a legal process, enforcing an order of the court, and any other duties imposed upon that officer.
And that term reasonable force is further delineated in the policy, is that right?
Yes.
If we take a look at Exhibit 217, I believe under the definition, objectively reasonable force. Could you please read that definition?
Yes. The amount and type of force that would be considered rational and logical to an objective officer on the scene supported by facts and circumstances known to an officer at the time the force was used.
Oh, you discussed a case, the Connor, right? The Connor factors, and I'd like you to, well, first of all, does the policy reference the Connor factors that you just mentioned?
Yes.
If you could display 217, page 2. And we have 3 bullet points here under the Connor factors, and that is the officer is supposed to look at the totality of the circumstances, right?
Yes.
And the 3 bullets here that the officer is supposed to consider are what?
The officer should consider the severity of the crime at issue, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others, and whether he is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight.
And fair to say these 3 different considerations are things that you can attribute to the subject, correct?
Yes.
That's the subject's conduct, not someone else's.
Yes.
And of course, it has to be judged by a reasonable police officer on the scene at the time, correct?
Yes.